I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you today. What we're going to talk about is modeling and simulation. And I often have to put the word computational in front of the modeling part, because when I tell people that I work in modeling consulting, they often think that I work with fashion models and things like that, which is actually quite far from the truth. I don't think there's any of us that can make that leap between industries that work in computational modeling. Yeah, so jumping right into it, why are we here? What's the point of this? What we're going to talk about today is using computational modeling and simulation work to get through the medical device development process faster. And there's a number of places that we can do that. We're going to talk through the different stages of product development and how the modeling and simulation works for getting answers to some of those questions up front. And we really want to get to the point where we're saving that time, getting through the FDA process and to commercialization as fast as we can. We want to save money. Obviously, that's a great goal as well. And result in a better product, something that we can show everyone the superiority of our product over the competitive devices in the market, or over the fact that there isn't anything quite like it out there yet. So this is me. I've been doing this for about 15 years. I started with a company called Valley Lab, and they kept changing the name of the company, and I kept doing the same job. It was Covidian and Medtronic before I left, and now we are about 18 months into a consulting company called System Insight that does this for companies of all sizes. We found that a lot of the more interesting projects are with smaller companies rather than with the large ones like Medtronic, who make that $90 billion a year, and they're really not interested in things that only make a paltry $10 or $100 million a year. So my background is in mechanical engineering, and in fact, Covidian paid for my PhD, and so my dissertation was on this very topic as well, which was using finite element modeling and simulation work to improve medical devices. In that case, we were working on TERP devices specifically, but we were able to improve the tissue effect of those devices using computational modeling and then turn that into a device later on. There's other things that are supposed to add to the credibility, like the PE license and the patents, but they aren't terribly relevant to what we're going to talk about today. When we do design, I have found this to be always the case, that the process of medical device design seems to be more about answering questions from the beginning to the end than anything else, because you start with an idea, and the first thing that comes out is questions. So whether you're the guy with the idea, or you're the person that has been tasked with implementing the idea, the first thing you're going to get is a series of questions from everybody. If you work with a contract manufacturer, they're going to have questions. If you're going to work with a design firm, they're going to have questions. If this is all internal to your company, the other people that are on your team are going to have questions. And those questions take all sorts of forms. Things like, how much power is this device going to take? Your hardware guy really wants to know that, because he's got to design the power system to deliver the power that you need. What are the performance expectations in human trials versus what we've been doing in preclinical testing? Those are questions that are a little bit later in the process, but they're equally important, because to that point you've been doing bench testing and you've been doing the animal side of things, and really the question is, as we get into humans, what can we expect to be different? And if it is different, which direction do we go in order to bring it back in line with our performance expectations? If you have something that involves data, like we were just talking about a few minutes ago, the sensors that we have, are they in an optimal place? Is this something that we can really use? And if we change our device to improve manufacturability, is that going to have an impact on its performance as a medical device, on the effect that we're looking for, that we designed this for in the first place? If we have to change some of these things in order to manufacture better, what do we get as the trade-off in all of that? So this boils down to primarily one concept, which is we all work on the engineering question sides of things, but the devices that we're making are all on the medical effect side of things. And what we want to do is kind of add some insight to that black box that you get in the middle, which is, if I put in things like power, and I put in things like changing the geometry of the electrodes, or I change the balloon size, or I change the flow rate of the coolant, what effect does that have on the far side about my ability to ablate diseased tissue, or the ability to cut through things or stop bleeding? Those are the things that on the far side that the medical community cares about. I have yet to meet a surgeon in the OR that looks at a patient and goes, you know what that needs right there is an extra 3 watts of power. Because they don't think that way. They think, that's still bleeding and it needs to stop. That's what they want to know. And physical prototypes are how we've done this all along. We build physical prototypes, we test them in that environment of bench and preclinical testing. And we are not only testing the questions that we have, but also we're testing the fidelity of the prototype that we built. And if we're building it fast because we need a quick answer to a question, that fidelity is lower, and we may be testing more of the way that we implemented the prototype than we are about the question that we were approaching in the first place. So the problem is the tissue. On the tissue side, we have a very noisy data source. And it is time-consuming, and it's expensive, and it's difficult to use, and doing this over and over and over again requires collection of data that you use statistical methods on in order to determine what the sample sizes are. It gets rather complicated in a hurry, especially if you're looking for very subtle changes in your device. If I change the radius on one of my graspers by 2 millimeters, and my question is, does the mechanical clamping force on this cause damage to the tissue? You may have to clamp on a lot of different tissues and do a lot of different histology before you get to the differentiation between a very small, subtle difference in your device. In fact, one study that we had suggests there's a 30% variation in tissue that we can't even account for. That just the fact that you're using tissue gives you a 30% variance that you can't control out of your study, which means you have to overcome it with sample sizes. And that's even after you're looking at all using renal arteries and in a porcine model, and we're controlling for right side versus left side, and we're controlling for the level of hydration, and we're controlling for the phase of the moon and the temperature in the room and anything else that we can think of. It still leaves that 30% variance. And that 30% makes it very hard to find those subtle differences in your device when that's what your data that you're really interested in does. So we started many years ago on the path of figuring out how to do the tissue effect modeling and simulation. So the nice thing about that is by the time you start putting in things like how do we apply the energy, and I'm going to refer to energy a lot because that was the background that I came from. I worked a lot in electrosurgery and other energy-based medical devices. So if the energy part is less applicable to what you do, we'll just kind of gloss over that part. But how do you apply the energy? What's the algorithm for what you do? If you have a device that's sensing something and you're putting light into it as an interrogation signal, how is that being applied? What are we doing there? On the instrument size, what material are we using? What are the geometries that we have? Is the thermal mass larger or smaller than between your different options? Things like how well is it in contact with the tissue that you're concerned with? And then you have the tissue behavior itself, which is its own complicating factor in all of this, because tissue does not stay the same. As you are going through whatever the medical device treatment is that you're doing, it's going to change. That's the whole point to why we build these devices in the first place, is that you want to be able to affect some medically relevant change to the tissue. If that's to remove gallbladders, that's one thing. If it's stopped bleeding, that's another thing. But in all of those cases, you need to account for the change in the tissue behavior over time. If you're adding energy like ultrasonic or electrical or laser energy into a tissue, you're going to change it over the course of time. The laser is not going to absorb in the same way and at the end of the procedure is at the beginning, because you've affected the way that it scatters and things like that. A lot of people are very familiar with simulation work, and they think of it in terms of finite element analysis, what's referred to as single physics FEA, which is built into a lot of 3D modeling software packages like SolidWorks or Creo. They have the ability to look at the mechanical stresses in your particular device, in the device itself, or maybe the heat transfer and thermal model inside your device or other engineering materials. It's fairly straightforward. What we're talking about here is something that's referred to as multiphysics, which seems to be gaining steam in terms of the capabilities within the simulation world, where we're linking these things together. Because as we were describing in tissue, if I'm applying electrical energy to tissue, it has a certain impedance to it. That impedance is going to drive how much of that electrical energy is converted into heat. That heat is going to drive out the water in the tissue, and it's going to change the impedance as well. And that's what that diagram on the far side there is, the interconnected nature of all the different parts of applying just electrical energy to tissue and what that does as far as things that you have to track in order to get an accurate representation of it. The upside to that is it allows us to model much more complex interactions than we used to be able to do. We can do this with complex materials like tissue for the first time. This is something that wasn't really within the toolbox of computational modeling or within the reach of most companies until the last 5 or 6 years. So why would we do it? What is it about modeling and simulation that's going to give us an advantage? And it's actually threefold in terms of developing your device. On the left-hand side, you've got the virtual modeling and virtual prototyping side of things, where we can iterate through design decisions and things like that and look at the expected results of that in terms of your particular device and the output that you have there. And in the middle, the second thing, in addition to virtual prototyping, is you can visualize things that are hard to see. It makes it a lot easier to communicate things to either non-technical audiences, whether they be customers or management or other people, but to be able to show them things like electrical fields in terms of a visual, instead of trying to describe it to them and just say that this field of strength is higher or lower, but to show them more of the complexities of that helps to show how your device works in ways that weren't really available before that. And the third one is the FDA has gotten on board with this over the last few years. Starting in 2014, they realized that they were stifling innovation, is the word that came out of there, around the level of data required in order to get approval of the devices. So they started down the path of what other data besides preclinical data can we use in order to make sure that we still have safe and effective devices, but get them through faster and lower that bar of how much work is required in order to get device approval. So the first one is that virtual prototyping. And there are, like I said at the beginning, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of questions on any one design as you progress from initial concept through commercialization. And a lot of times, it's a question around specific attributes. And if you take something that, a device that you've got 3 or 4 attributes that you want, that you're not quite sure what they need to be yet, and they all have 3 or 4 different and they have different options as far as what they could be, different settings, different range of values that they could be, different materials, all of those things. They start to interact with each other, and you can have, if you wanted to investigate all of them, you could be talking about prototypes for for months and even possibly years. If it takes you, anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks for your fast turnaround prototypes, if you iterate through that more than 2 or 3 times, you're spending a significant amount of time doing the prototyping and test cycles. What simulation allows you to do is to look at all of those. We've had clients where we've run 500 plus different combinations of design parameters and looked at the response of the tissue in terms of what they're interested in doing up front, which is creating a surface much like the one that's kind of in the background here about the thing that we're interested in. What does that look like in terms of as we vary these other parameters around? Let's find the one that maximizes the positive things we're looking for and minimizes the things that we're less interested in doing. And move forward from there. And to run something like 500 different prototypes, even just the testing side of that would take a significant amount of time. But there's other advantages to doing your virtual prototyping as well. So you can also start to look at things like the design tolerances that you have. So you can run through the simulation side of things. If I do the upper bounds and lower bounds of the things that are cheap, of the parameters that are cheaper to produce. So if I open up my tolerances a bit, I can produce something for less money, and I just want to make sure that it's still going to work. That my tolerances don't have to be that sub-tenth of a millimeter. Maybe we can open it up a little bit and make for a cheaper production cost. Also for troubleshooting, if you are building prototypes and those prototypes come back with behaviors that you're not really sure what's causing them, you can run simulation on that to see if you can replicate those results by looking at those root causes and putting them into the simulation side of things and see if that's what's getting it out, rather than taking a guess at it and building more prototypes to see if you got rid of it. And we talked about the cost-saving size. If you can open up those tolerances a bit, that's going to change your manufacturing costs for the overall project, impacting the bottom line eventually. It also is something that you can do in the product development space around evaluating new technologies. If your question up front is really just, can we even do this? You can plug that in and look at the large-scale version in simulation to see if it's even possible to use that technology for the type of effect that you're looking for. And at the bottom, the Monte Carlo simulations are a pretty powerful tool to use as well, because that allows you to put a range of inputs. So as we talked about before, tissue itself has kind of a variability to it. You can put that variability into the simulation side, and you can tie all of these things together and say, if we have this variability in our device, and we have this variability in our algorithm, and we have this variability in sensitivity in our sensors, and we have this variability in the tissue that we're looking at itself, whether it's diseased or healthy tissue, and all of those things. At the end, what is the variability that we have in our output, the things that the surgeon is going to care about, and is it within the realm of what we care or what we can accept? On the regulatory side, we talked a little bit about this in the introduction, but they've in the last 2 years have been moving in the direction of providing that guidance that allows companies to use simulated data as part of their regulatory submissions. I have seen and been a part of projects where we've used simulated data to show the safety of a device that has cut 6 months out of an 8-month testing process for a regulatory approval. Where a device was being submitted, they were curious, they really wanted to have data about the worst case. This was something that was software and algorithm controlled based on sensor feedback, and they weren't entirely sure where the worst case was. So we saved them the 6 months of hunting for that worst case through physical testing, by running it through simulation and finding it for them, presenting that data to the FDA, and allowing them to go forward with just that narrow band of worst case rather than having to go look for it in the first place. Down at the bottom, the FDA guidance on reporting computational modeling studies came out in 2016. The draft came out in 2014. It's out. It provides a framework The ASME VNV40 is a VNV guidance document and standard for computational modeling in medical devices. Last I heard, it was supposed to come out last November. I haven't seen an updated date for it, but it's not out quite yet either, so it should be out sometime this year, would be my guess. And what those documents do is they provide this type of a framework that you can use in order to include that simulation data as part of your FDA submission. They want to make sure that you're hitting all of these areas when you go and bring them data that you want to make design decisions off of. They want to make sure that you're covering things like the code verification, that you've looked at all the different sources of error. You've made sure that your context of use is appropriate for this type of model, and you check all of those boxes. So they go through in those two documents and give you that framework through this type of a flow chart and these type of design frameworks to get you through that process, that you can provide all that to them and get information out. The other strong part of simulation is the data visualization side. It's one thing to tell someone that this is where all the heat's going and this is what happens when we heat up our device and how it cools down. It's another one entirely to show them a field full of arrows and say, look at the big arrows, that's where the heat's going. It's much more intuitive. It's a lot easier to communicate that information. The one on the other side is those are models that are built off of CT data. So it's entirely possible to take this all the way down to patient-specific data if you're working with a surgeon or with a hospital, and you can take a single patient that maybe they are familiar with and be able to show how the device is going to work in that specific application, or how it would have worked in that specific application. But being able to bring in that level of personalization into how would a theoretical device work, or how does our particular device work, and show them in applications that they care about, is a very powerful tool that allows that to move forward very quickly with understanding how things work. And it used to be, and the reason for that this is all coming out now is that it used to be that in order to do this type of simulation, it was kind of confined to national labs. It was confined to places like IBM, where they had the computational resources to do it. There's a lot of overhead that goes into that, right? So in order to build and maintain clusters of computers or supercomputers and things like that, they required a level of specialization and overhead that you needed to be an organization large enough that it made financial sense to do that. Obviously, that's not small companies, that's not mid-sized companies. In fact, even most of the large medical device manufacturers didn't really have the bandwidth to do that sort of thing. And these types of simulations were either simplified down to the point where they answered very specific questions and they weren't terribly universal, or they would just take so long to run that it was just easier to go out and physically prototype these things and get your answers that way. But it also required that you have your own in-house experts to do it. And that type of overhead, both in IT and in terms of simulation, really limited the application of doing that. But today, we have all these companies that have very nicely put together very large data centers that they're more than happy to sell computational time on to anyone that needs to crunch large amounts of data. And people like Amazon are happy to use their systems with people that aren't doing user interface stuff, because we don't require that feedback of immediate less than a second kind of response. And so we've taken Amazon Web Services and used their cloud-based computing resources to run a number of simulations that probably would have taken us three or more months to do in-house on our largest workstations, and been able to get answers back in 6 hours, which is a huge difference as far as the usefulness of that information to our clients. So this is another technology that's available. Not only is the FDA landscape changing, but the technology landscape's changing and making this available to medical device companies of all sorts. And here's the but side. But there are two caveats to this. Now, simulation is great and computational modeling is great, but every simulation requires experimental validation and convergence tests. You have to make sure that the data that you're producing matches reality. It is very easy to make very pretty pictures in a computer that have no bearing on reality whatsoever. So you have to often be tying this back and making sure that the results you're getting are making sense through physical testing. So in no way is this going to replace all of that, but it's going to certainly augment it and make it more useful. And you also can't model what you don't understand. So as a medical device company, if you don't understand the physics behind how your device works, you can't really leverage modeling and simulation to do it. And there's a lot of companies out there that have FDA-approved devices that they just know if they do A, B, and C, they always get their result that they're looking for, and they collected data that way, and it's out on the market that way, but they really don't know the mechanism of action behind it. So there's a surprising number of companies in that boat. So, and last, I have spent a lot of time looking at different software development decision-making techniques, and one of them is to look at the cost of delay. And what that basically says is that if I delay my project, I don't change the ramp-up time in the front end, and I don't really change the obsolescence on the back end, but for every month that I delay launching my product, I'm basically cutting a month out of my peak sales in the middle. Which as an engineer, I never really understood why it was that the business development people were pulling their hair out when we would delay projects, because it wasn't really that much additional cost, but it turns out what they were pulling their hair out over was the lost revenue more than it was what we were costing them at the time. But what simulation allows us to do is turn that cost of delay into an opportunity instead. So we're not taking time out of that peak sales, we're putting more time into it because it allows you to get your device to market faster, and so you end up spending more time in that peak sales realm before you get to the obsolescence side. So the takeaways are the four that we started with, right? That modeling and simulation significantly reduces the time for medical device development. If you do this as part of the entire project, it can cut as much as half of the development time out of your project, depending on the complexity of the project and how you're doing it. The modeling and simulation can reduce the regulatory load required by the FDA. We talked a bit about that. Covered using it as an effective tool for visualization, and that the changing technology landscape has allowed us to do more of this. So with that, I hope I kept you to your clean slate of good presentations.
Give me your hand. Nope, not that one. This one.
You want
nope,
this one?
This one. We did it. We had a clean slate of really well done presentations. Arlen, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.